Welcome back to Alive and Well's Daily Dose, your daily dose of support. And as we're thinking about continuing to build out our self care toolkit, we're going to learn today about all of the benefits of gardening, even if you don't have that green thumb. And so, helping us in this discussion today, we have Drew Dinges, who is the assistant manager at Bowood Farms. He's also a horticulturalist by degree, as well as a hobbied herbalist. And so we're so grateful that you're here with us today to share your wisdom as we can learn about how to include gardening in our self-care toolkit.
Cool.
Now, now, Drew, I want to ask you, besides, getting to see kind of the tangible fruits of your labor, what sorts of benefits do gardening have for our well-being?
There's a couple different things. I usually at my house focus more on the edible aspects of gardening. We live in Tower Grove South, just off of South Grand, and we have an old farmhouse. So when we first built our raised beds. We have 12 raised beds now. So we do a lot of growing your own food and then growing a lot of your own herbs, which is what I really love to do. Not just for culinary uses, you can use them, of course, to spice up any dish or things like that. But I do a lot of healing remedies with them, be it different teas, drying them for different aspects. So from a food and herbal standpoint, there's really great ways to garden and kind of get your hands dirty, so to speak, to help mind, body, and spirit. And gardening in general, especially in times like these, getting outside, getting that sunlight that you've been missing is always great for your well-being. But doing it so to provide food and then herbs that you can then turn into healing remedies is kind of the double whammy, which I've really enjoyed getting into.
Wonderful. Now, it's kind of humorous for me because I have to share with you, Drew, I do not have a green thumb whatsoever. And even, those plants that everyone swears that you can't kill, I seem to find a magical way to make that happen. So I'm really eager to get to learn about this and enhance my own green thumb, and just find something else to do.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. That's the nice thing about being in a retail horticulture field is you get to educate people. In horticulture, you can do a lot of different things, and a lot of them you're only working with plants. And one thing that I like about the platform that Bowood provides is we have the retail space, but then we also have the studio space, which you can take all these classes. A lot of them are inexpensive, and they have master gardeners from the botanical gardens that come. But then they also have people like you that are like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm just hoping to figure this out. So that's the great thing about the studio at Bowood is we can provide kind of a learning space and a safe space for any type of gardeners and any type of experience level that sometimes can be intimidating. If you take a class at the botanical gardens, you're going to be like, I don't belong here. Whereas sometimes if you take it at Bowood, it's a little more relaxed and it's for all different experiences. But yeah, I always joke my husband is not a gardener in any way, shape, or form. So he doesn't really know what we're growing sometimes, and that's okay. I always steer him towards the easy stuff and say, try not to kill this. And sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. So there's a wide variety of gardeners out there.
Well, so for people who might just be getting started, for someone who wants to expand their self-care toolkit and wants to maybe start exploring with gardening during this time of social distancing, how is it that we may get started in growing something, and what might you suggest that we begin growing?
Sure. Houseplants are always a great way to kind of spruce up your indoor space. And I think a lot of people have really taken to that while they're spending more time at home. So you can always buy indoor houseplants just to help clean air properties and spruce up your home, kind of bring the outdoors in. But one thing that I really enjoy doing is more of the food and herbal aspects. And the reason I like to do that, one, you get more out of it. If I put a fern in my house, I get it and it's pretty and it improves the air quality. But if I grow tomatoes in my front yard, then I get dinner out of it. Or if I grow peppermint, I can put it into a mojito or I can make tea out of it. So I really like getting a little more input and feedback from my landscape. So one of the things that I really enjoy doing is the herbal and edible sides of gardening. And one of the main reasons I like to do that is because it's affordable. A lot of times you don't have to have a lot of money for vegetable gardening and or herb gardening. Whereas sometimes
Mhm.
indoor houseplants and things like that and trees and shrubs can be expensive because you're paying for the quality of plant. Whereas herbs and veggies are usually low budget, items, which are great because then they're accessible to new gardeners and people who just don't really know as much. I always think people get intimidated when they're going to buy a $200 fiddle leaf fig for their living room. That's an investment, whereas a $2 tomato plant or a $4 tomato plant isn't as much. So I think for a newer gardener, you can really indulge yourself in buying a lot of inexpensive plants and not being so worried if you don't have the best luck with them. The other thing that's great about edible gardening and herbal gardening is that you can do it whether you're in an urban environment or if you're outside and have a big lawn. One of the beautiful things about Bowood Farms is we are in the heart of the Central West End, so a lot of our customers do not have an outdoor space. So we always focus on kind of bringing the outdoors in, growing things inside or growing things on your balcony. You know, you don't have to have the 12 raised beds in your front yard like I do. You can, which is great. But one of the things that's really fun about working in an urban garden center is to find creative, innovative ways to kind of bring the outdoors in and grow things without having the use of a yard.
Wonderful. No, and I love the fact that regardless of where we live, whether we're in an apartment, whether maybe we have a house but no outdoor space, or maybe we do have an outdoor space, there's something that each of us can engage in. And I think one of the things that really fascinates me as I'm, starting to get a little bit stir crazy just being inside is getting to be outside and knowing that it's a task that the whole family can engage in. Maybe we're not so mobile, or maybe we do have more mobility, we have children. And so getting the whole family involved, regardless of our maybe mobility.
Yeah, that's another thing that's great about the studio. One of our employees, Kathy, does a lot of seed starting stuff, and we also
Mhm.
have classes that are geared towards family, things for kids, because incorporating kids into gardening, they love it. And not only is it an educational tool, but you get them away from their computer screens and away from their phones to get outside a bit. So we do a lot of different kid, either art classes or gardening classes at Bowood. So I really think that it's a great time anytime in the spring to work on building community and family through the gardening practices, but also including little ones, because a lot of times they love it, even if they're just shoveling dirt or throwing different seeds out. You know, it's a good way to incorporate family bonding time, especially in times like this when we're all a little stir crazy and need to get out.
So if we're wanting to start our gardening experience with maybe some edible gardening, what might be a vegetable or an herb that is pretty easy to grow, even from just a seed that we could do, whether we just have a small fire escape or an outdoor potter? What might we be able to start planting for those of us with a little less experience and a little
Sure.
less of a green thumb?
I do a lot of my gardening at my house from seed. So if you want to grow from seed, some of the stuff that I've had really good luck with from an herbal standpoint is any of your kind of leafy green stuff. Think your basils, cilantros, parsleys, things like that, chives, dill. You can literally just toss them out into your garden beds or your containers, and you usually get pretty good luck out of them. Whereas things like rosemary, lavender, thyme, they can be a little trickier from seeds. You might want to buy those from a start. But a lot of the herbs and things like that are great to grow in containers, whether it be a hydroponic system, whether you have grow lights, or whether it's just a couple terracotta pots in your living space. The main thing with growing those is you want to provide as much sunlight as you can. Most herbs and vegetables, for that matter, really thrive outdoors. So giving them the most light that you can have is going to be your key for that. And then especially times like this when we're all a little stir crazy at home, you have to be mindful with your watering. A lot of herbs and houseplants in general kind of don't like to be overwatered. And even as someone who's a degreed horticulturist, it's one thing I've been struggling with while being at home so much more is I want to give all my love and attention to my houseplants, a little more so than I have been. And so you have to be kind of mindful to not love them too much, so to speak. So there's a lot of different herbs and things like that that you can grow in container, whether it be from transplant or starts. Or seeds rather, that are really easy. As far as vegetables, now's a good time to be doing a lot of spinaches, leafy greens, kind of your cold crops. I've seen a lot of people putting their tomatoes and peppers out, and I always say wait until Mother's Day, because we're St. Louis. We can have fluctuating temperatures and things like that. It was like 30 degrees the other day. I have a friend in Chicago who was sending me videos of it snowing last weekend. So our last frost date in St. Louis is actually April 15th. So I always usually in my garden, whether it be in containers or in the ground, wait to put out those summer loving stuff, your tomatoes, your peppers, things like that, until mid to late May, just to make sure that it doesn't frost. But a lot of the spring veggies are really easy and good to grow in containers, like your lettuces, your kales, your Swiss chard, things like that are really, really easy. One of my personal favorites is radishes. We grow a ton of radishes at my house because you can eat the entire plant. We saute the greens, we eat the different bulbs and things like that. So I really like getting the most out of my stuff. Yeah, so it's really easy to incorporate stuff, whether it be in the ground or in containers. Just be mindful of frost dates. It's still getting a little cold at night. So maybe a little early for your tomatoes and peppers, especially for novice gardeners. In about a week or two, we should be getting to where you can plant them outside. The nice thing about doing container gardening, though, is if you have all these outside, today it's supposed to be like 70. So set them out, let them soak up the sun, or put them in a sunny window. Just bring them in at night to make sure they don't get nipped by the frost.
So what supplies might we need to get started? Given that, I'm in an apartment, I don't even know what supplies I need. Do I just need to use dirt from outside, or do I need to buy soil? What kind of containers? What sorts of supplies might I need to get started in this new self-care activity?
Sure. It's kind of different for herbs and for veggies. I would say
Mhm.
that herbs are a little more carefree and a little less maintenance. You can just use a regular potting mix for those. So any type of potting mix you get from either your big box stores like Lowe's or Home Depot, or if you get them from independent garden centers like Bowood, just a nice organic potting mix. Anything that I do that I'm going to eat, I do organic gardening with, just because it's important for me. You don't have
Mhm.
to do it that way, but it's nice to get a nice, just organic potting mix for your herbs. And you can grow them in the ground or in containers. A lot of times they like it a little snug. So sometimes people will put, typically herbs are grown in what we call a 4-inch container. So they're about that big. I always say it's about the size your palms are. And they don't need big containers. You can put them in that if you put a couple in, but a lot of times they thrive in smaller containers, which is why they're so great for urban gardeners or people who are space limited. So any kind of potting soil would work for them. They don't need as much, and they also don't need as much fertilization. A lot of times when you fertilize your herbs, it will cause them to go leggy or cause them to flower, which some herbs you can eat the flowers. I can talk about that later because I love edible flowers. But a lot of them, when they do go to flower, they get a little bitter and don't taste as good. So
Okay.
the main thing with herbs, they're really easy. You kind of can't mess it up. It's tricky to do it just digging in the soil outside
Mm.
because we're in St. Louis or the Missouri area, and we have horrible clay soils in Missouri. So a lot of times they're just going to be really compacted and not allow for good drainage, whereas something like a potting mix will give good drainage. And then as far as vegetables and other edibles, you want to incorporate more compost, things like that, that'll give a little more nutrition, a little more organic matter. And there's great places like St. Louis Composting. I live off of South Grand, so I've gone to Carondelet Park before. They have free compost. But
Mhm.
then we also have bagged stuff, which is great for the urban gardener. I have a little pickup truck, so I can go to Carondelet Park, fill my truck with soil, and then come back. If you don't want to do that or you don't have the space for that, you can always get bagged compost as well. And incorporating that into whatever potting mix or soil you're going to be using, whether it be container or in the ground, is going to provide more nutrients for the edible plants to kind of grow more, whereas herbs just don't need it as much.
Now, out of all of these things that you said are good to start with, if we don't have an outdoor space whatsoever, are there herbs as well as vegetables and fruits that we can grow just strictly indoors?
Yeah, that's kind of a hard question because I always try to tell people, can you do it? Yes. Just know that they will thrive outdoors. They will be better and yield more outdoors just because they're outdoor plants. But you can do it inside. I always say that a lot of my herbs that thrive indoors are a little bit more of my leafy green varieties. So that
Mhm.
would be things like your cilantros, basils, mint, chives, parsleys. Just because sometimes the woody herbs, like your thyme, lavender, and rosemary, they can be a little tricky to grow indoors. Main thing with that again is going to provide a lot of sunlight. At my house, we have grow lights. You can find a ton of different grow lights, whether it be from your independent garden centers or Amazon or your big box stores. Grow lights are great, but you don't necessarily have to have them. Main thing is give them as much sunlight as you can give them, and that will hopefully help it. As far as edible stuff indoors, as far as veggies, that's a little trickier. I always joke. I get a lot of questions about how can I grow stuff inside, and my niece, who is 11 years old, actually just got an indoor hydroponic thing for her birthday. And
Mm.
she showed me within 2 weeks, she's already got basil growing and cilantro. So I'm like, look, if my 11-year-old niece in Springfield, Missouri can do it in her bedroom, I think everybody can do it. So it's a great thing to incorporate. There's lots of different little tabletop hydroponic things and grow lights that you can use, but they're not required. Main thing is give them lots and lots of sunlight. Veggies to grow indoors, I think your leafy greens are going to be the best, like your salads, salad stuff, spinach, lettuce, kales. But you could also do things like strawberries. I've seen those flower indoors and produce. It's all going to be how much light you have. That's going to be the main factor for that.
Okay. And is there a difference then in the amount of water we need to give a plant or a vegetable that we may be growing inside versus outside?
Sure. I would say indoors, it's probably a little less because it's a much more controlled environment. If
Mhm.
you're anything like me, I don't want my house over 75 degrees in the summer. Like usually it's at a good 72.
Mhm.
Outside, it'll be much higher. So keep that in mind. Keep the outdoor climate in mind. If you have things indoor and outdoor, you might need to do your stuff outside a little bit more, water it a little bit more, because it's going to be exposed to those elements and that high humidity. Whereas inside, it's so much more of a controlled environment that you don't need to um, water it as much. I always tell people with watering, as a general rule of thumb, don't set a watering day. Each plant has its own different requirements. So when I first started gardening, and a lot of novice gardeners are like, Friday's my watering day. I'm going to water everything I own, which is great. But some things want it more than that, and some things want it less than that. So it takes a little more time. But I always tell people to check individual plants, and when they start to dry out, give them a little bit more to drink, rather than just doing a blanket watering at one given day.
Now, so I don't know how accurate this is, but somewhere along the line the way I learned that you need to water a plant till the water starts dripping through the entire pot. Is that actually the case? Is that when it tells us that the plant has all the water it needs, or or is that just a something I picked up or made up along the way?
No, that's a really good fact. One thing that I like to stress with people, there's two different types of pots, so to speak, out there. There's something called a cache pot, which is just a French term for a pot that doesn't have a drainage hole. You can
Okay.
call that like a cover pot or a decorative pot. With pots that don't have drainage holes, you don't want a direct plant in them because then the soil is going to get wet and there's nowhere for the water to escape from. So the nice thing about having containers or grow pots, a lot of times my decorative pots or even baskets, things like that, I keep the plants in a grow pot and then take it out to water it. So when you're watering, a good general rule of thumb, especially for newer gardeners, is what we call in the hort industry just flooding the pot. You want to just flood the water all the way through because then you're realizing that, okay, the water is absorbing all of the plant stock there and it's actually giving it a good drink. I always train our new employees, whether they have experience with plants or not, to give baby drinks more often. It's nice to just kind of go, okay, give it a little bit, let it trickle out. You don't necessarily have to completely saturate and drench it all the time.
Now, I remember back in elementary school, and we're talking about now, Drew, decades ago, right? That as part of an in-class project, we took a 2-liter soda bottle and we cut out just like the bottom third, and then just punctured holes in the bottom as our kind of planting pot. Is that something we can do? Is that something you recommend? Or if we don't have a pot, how can we get started at home?
Yeah, that's a great way. It's no coincidence that teachers have been using that method for a while. We actually did, I think it was just in January, Kathy did a whole milk jug gardening class where it was kind of the same concept where you just took a gallon milk jug and cut it in half and then created a little ecosystem or greenhouse effect with that. The nice thing with using tops and things like that is you're going to get a little more humidity, which helps seeds germinate in order to begin growing. So when I first started gardening, I was in a small apartment right by Sweetie Pie's in the Grove. So I had no outdoor space. I was in college and I had no money. So I would get like 2-liter bottles of soda and drink them and then puncture holes in the sides and hang them and make them little containers. So you
Ooh.
can totally make your own containers out of anything and everything. Some of my friends do what's called egg carton gardening, where they'll start their seeds in just a biodegradable egg carton. You can
Oh.
also do that. Really effective, really inexpensive too, which is great, especially in times like this when we're at home and we can't go out and buy the things that we normally could get really easily. You have to get a little more crafty and a little more innovative in using the things that you have around your house. So things like milk jugs, soda containers, 2-liter bottles, so to speak, stuff like that is totally great for it. Again, the thing that's nice about that 2-liter bottle milk jug thing is it creates a dome top, which gives it relative humidity for the plants, which helps them grow.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
Great.
you're basically making your own greenhouse. Think of it that way. You just
Wonderful.
didn't know.
See, I know a little bit more about gardening than I
Right.
thought I did.
That's what I always tell people. When novice gardeners start to talk, you realize they know more than they think they know.
So we have a question from Ruth, and the question is that she's interested in raised gardening and how might we go about that? And Drew, for us who don't have the gardening lingo, can you also explain what a raised garden is?
Sure. A lot of times, raised gardening beds are just creating a garden bed that's lifted above the grade of the soil that you already have. The
Mhm.
beautiful thing about that is, like I was saying earlier, a lot of our soils in St. Louis are really clay bound. And so they don't have good drainage and they don't have good material in them because a lot of them are urban compacted soils from our living spaces and from humans interacting the garden. So one thing that you can do that kind of came into the light over the last 10, 20 years is raised bed gardening. And all that is, you could consider it as like container gardening, is a lot of times you can build them out of cedar or different woods. I have 12 in my front yard that are all cedar beds. One note with that, sometimes ambitious new gardeners are like, okay, I'm going to grow the biggest garden ever. It's going to be great. With that, one rule of thumb, most garden beds that are raised beds are 4 by 4 for a reason, because the human can usually only reach about 2 feet in from any side. So when
Mm.
I first built a garden bed, it was like 9 feet by 9 feet. And of course, I put my tomato right in the middle. And then I was like, well, how do I get to that plant? So good rule of thumb with raised bed gardening is keep it at about a 4 by 4 ratio, and then you can access it from all sides. As far as building your own raised beds, you can buy them from different places. You can get kits. You can do them with cinder blocks. You can do a technique called hay bale, where it's just blocks of hay that you can do. I live in Tower Grove South, and we have a big front yard, and all of this is in my front yard. So I
Mhm.
had to convince my husband to allow me to do this because it is our front yard. So we went with cedar because it's a little more ornamental and it looks a little better because it's our front yard. The male person sees it every day. Our in-laws see it when they're coming over for holidays. So there are nice ornamental ways to do that. But the beautiful thing about that is you're creating your own soil between a mix of compost and topsoil to give yourself a better growing medium than just tossing your seeds out into the ground and hoping that they grow in our Missouri clays.
Wonderful. So if we're looking to get started with all this, and I know you mentioned like ways we can, create at-home starter kits. Um, do you recommend us getting seeds from, just anywhere, or what do we need to be aware of when we're purchasing seeds to get things started?
Sure. There's a ton of different seed companies out there. I've worked in the green industry for almost 8 years now. So some that I used to buy when I was a buyer, Botanical Interest has been around forever. It's just botanicalinterest.com. They have everything. At Bowood, we carry, I think, like 3/4 of their seed catalogs. So you can find those at the botanical gardens. You can find them at Bowood, which is great. So love botanical interests. There's also cool companies like Seed Savers or Plants of Merit, I think, have some seeds as well that are a little bit more prairie flower native ones. But one company that I really love, especially in times like this to support local, it's called Seed Geeks. And if you're a fan of the farmers market, I live a couple blocks from Tower Grove Park, so I know Angela who owns it. They have honey, they have soaps, but they also have a ton of seeds that they all have. I think they're based out of Warrenton, Missouri. So it's a local product. They sell them in St. Louis. And I've just had really good luck with their seeds. They're good prices. They're easy to find. I think theirs is just seedgeeks.com. Another one that's really good is Baker Creek Seeds. They're in Mansfield, Missouri. They are like this seed mecca of all these heirloom variety seeds that are kind of old, tried and true varieties that plant geeks like myself love to get because they're kind of the weird stuff. So I would say Botanical Interest, Seed Geeks, and Baker Creek are my three favorites.
Wonderful. Now, as we're thinking about getting started with this and we're planning out our gardening for self-care, is there anything else that we need to be aware of as we get going and we start on this gardening journey?
Sure. One thing that I always like to tell people from an herbal standpoint, there
Mhm.
are some herbs that are a little invasive, like mint. If you put mint in your ground, whether it be a raised bed or you just dig a hole in the yard and plant it in there, you will have a yard of mint in a couple years. It can be really, really invasive. So there are certain things. Mint is probably the only herb or edible that's that invasive.
Mhm.
So I always just grow it in its own container. I grow a lot of varieties of it. But if you put it in a raised bed or things like that, it can kind of take over and go a little crazy. So just do your research on different plants, things like that. The other thing is I always try to watch how I fertilize and how I care for my garden. I did a class last fall that was called like the Humane Gardener. And it's all about, okay, I've created this 12 raised bed, lots of native plants in my front yard, and now nature's responding, which is great. That's what it does. So I have a lot more birds and different rodents and things like that in Tower Grove, which is great. But then they started eating all my berries, my blueberries, and my different tomatoes get knocked off by the city squirrels. So I always tell people that are novice gardeners know that if you create different plantscapes, um, nature will respond. And to me, that's a beautiful thing. But you have to kind of overplant or take that into consideration that, okay, you don't want to spray stuff that will hurt the birds that are coming in. Because to me, if I'm planting a serviceberry tree, which grows natively here, mine just bloomed last week and we'll have a ton of serviceberries in a week. Well, if I want them, of course, the robin that made a nest in my kitchen window is going to want them too. And so to me as a horticulturist, I think that's one of the joys of gardening is kind of thinking outside of the human spectrum and creating a landscape for not just us to eat. Now, that being said, I do have a garden bunny or two that likes a lot of my greens. So I planted a bunch of hostas on the side just so that it eats those rather than my lettuce.
Mm.
So there are creative ways that you can try to get around it. Another thing that's great for people who are worried about squirrels, you can put red pepper flakes down in your garden. It gets on their paws and it kind of burns them a little bit, which sounds inhumane, but it's better than other alternatives. So just sprinkling red pepper flakes can kind of help with some of the city rodents that you might have. So just kind of being mindful and being aware of the landscape and the community that you're creating is kind of a good thing to work on as a gardener, especially in times like this when we are putting so much into our landscapes. That's one of the things I've really, really enjoyed about this time at home is kind of watching how nature doesn't care about humans. You know, we're all adjusting to being at home and all of these changes that are going on. And nature is like, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want. It's been a great year for tulips and the serviceberries and the red buds have been crazy. So it's been cool to kind of alter your awareness, so to speak, of
Mhm.
like, oh, Mother Nature is kind of going to do her thing, regardless of what's going on in our world. And it's been nice as a mindfulness practice to sit back and kind of take a pleasure in that and also take alertness and like, okay, I can learn a bit from Mother Nature. She's been here a while and she doesn't really have to deal with some of the stuff we as humans have to deal with.
I really love that, and I think that's something that I don't often think about is the way that, we're out in nature and how nature is going to respond, that there's a cyclical process. And so getting to see other forms of, the community, other animals and creatures and flies and bees, getting to respond and interact, and how that can also be something really exciting to get to see, of how we're kind of giving back and being part of that cycle. So, well, Drew, I want to say thank you so very much for sharing your insight, for giving of your time to, talk to our viewers about how we can add gardening to our self-care toolkit. I'm ready and eager to start some of my own. I may have to start small and see
Right.
successes along the way before I go bigger, but I'm eager to start this as part of my own self-care practice.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing that I always like to promote, we do have shopbowood.com, which you can shop remotely and shop and pick up curbside, which is great. Wednesday is Earth Day. So a lot of the gardeners out there are getting stir crazy and want to go and do stuff. So on Bowood's social media, we will be doing an Instagram live of a whole herbalism class that I was going to teach this spring. So that'll be at Tuesday or Wednesday at 2 o'clock. So if you guys want a little more nitty gritty details, it'll have specific growing information for all the herbs that we have at Bowood, and that'll be on our Instagram. So you can always follow us there, follow us on social media, stuff like that, to keep engaged and keep interactive in your gardens and landscapes at this time.
Wonderful. I'll be tuning in myself to learn a little bit more. Thank you so very much for joining us. For our viewers who are tuning in live or after the fact, your daily dose challenge is going to be to think outside of the box for your self-care and consider starting doing some gardening, whether it's indoors or outdoors, using any of the cool techniques that Drew has shared with us today, recognizing this can be a fun as well as an inexpensive practice that we can use to begin this process, and fun for all ages to engage in. So, again, many thanks to Drew, many
Thank you
thanks to
guys.
our viewers who tuned in, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.
Bye guys. Happy Earth Day.